learning can replicate temporal outcomes of a complex simulation model using an opioid policy example.
Okay. Sorry. Hello, everyone. I want to start with thanking to my co-authors on this study. And let's move to my talk. The motivation behind this study came from a casual conversation where we asked, can we replicate the temporal trends of a simulation? So what that means is, can we reproduce the temporal outcomes from a simulation without actually running the simulation? So, but why do we need to replicate the results at the first place? In some cases, simulations may take a lot of time to run, or we may want to perform a computationally demanding analysis, or we may want to generate instantaneous results at the click of a button. For example, if you design an online simulator, you want your simulation to be as quick as possible. So for all these cases, if we can replace the complex simulation with a simpler model, it would be ideal. So this idea of replicating the results of a simulation is called metamodeling. So similar to simulations try to replicate real-life dynamics, metamodels try the same on the simulations. But as you may guess, with each of these added layers, we would further deviate from the actual output. But if that deviation is reasonably small, we can replace our computationally burdensome simulation with a simpler model. So I want to first introduce you our case study, which is opioid policy simulation model, shortly Opium. Opium is designed to simulate the ongoing opioid epidemic in the United States. And in the recent years, because of the overprescription of opioid medications and inexpensive illicit heroin, the United States has faced with one of the deadliest epidemics in its history. And by using a system dynamic approach, Opium can project the outcomes of the opioid epidemic from 2002 to 2025. For example, Opium can project the prevalence of prescription opioid use, or illicit opioid use, or total overdose deaths. So our objective is to develop a meta model for Opium, basically. But I want you to note that we are trying to replicate a temporal trend. So this is different than replicating a single outcome or a few outcomes, as done in other metamodeling studies. So I want to move to our methodology. So machine learning is a commonly used technique in metamodeling. And the idea behind machine learning is we basically try to reveal the relationship between an input-output pair by exploiting the observed data. So this exploiting the data part is called training, if you are familiar with it. So under the metamodeling concept, the inputs stands for the parameters of the simulation model. The outputs are the outcomes of the simulation model, and the data is basically the simulated samples. And one final note is, because we are trying to replicate a series of outcomes, we want to adopt a multi-output machine learning model. So some of you may be familiar, but there are a lot of machine learning techniques that we can utilize. In this study, we used a powerful algorithm called deep neural networks, shortly DNNs. And by DNNs has these special structures called hidden layers and neurons. And by combining the activation functions of different neurons at multiple layers, we can estimate complex input-output dynamics. And the DNN model that we developed for the Opium has an input layer, hidden layers, and the output layers. In the input layer, we have 18 neurons. Each corresponds to a particular simulation parameter. in the output layers, we have 4 outcomes over 24 years from 2002 to 2025, which makes a total of 96 neurons. But what about the hidden layer? The structure of the hidden layer is something that we need to decide before we start the training process. So in general, a DNN with more layer and more neurons is more powerful, but increasing the network size can substantially increase the training time. Therefore, we need to find a way to optimize the network size based on our needs. There are many options that we can play with when we are designing a deep neural network, and these options are called hyperparameters. And one can tune all these hyperparameters to reach the desired accuracy level that they want. But in this study, for the purpose of this study, we focused on 3 of them. Epochs, which is basically the number of iterations in the training process, number of hidden layers, and the number of neurons per layer. We also fixed some other hyperparameters for this study. And as our performance measure, we use mean absolute percentage error, which is basically the absolute deviation of our predicted results from the observed data. And at the end, we want to compare different DNNs based on this final performance, which is basically the average over all years and all outcomes. Now let's move to, let's look at the performance at 1,000 epochs. And this is a heat map showing on the x-axis, it has the number of hidden layers. On the y-axis, it has the number of neurons per layer. And each cell shows the accuracy, the MAPE value for that particular combination. So as you can see, the DNN with the smallest network size, which is 1 by 100, gives the best MAPE value at 1,000 epochs, which is 8.25%. But when we move to 10,000 epochs, this goes down to 2.37%, which is again the smallest MAPE value, but it seems like others are also catching up. When we move to 100,000 epochs, now this goes down to 1.9%, but it's not the best. It doesn't have the best MAPE value anymore. The best MAPE value is observed when there are 6 hidden layers and 300 neurons per layer. So for your reference, training the smallest network takes about 1 minute, and training this largest network takes about 8 hours. So let's move to the results that we got by this 6 hidden layer by 300 neurons DNN. So these blacks show the results that we got from the Opium, and these yellow ones are that we got from the Metamodels. So as you can see, they pretty much overlap, and we cannot see any difference for most of the times. So in summary, we replicated the temporal outcomes of a simulation using metamodeling with deep neural networks. And we said such a metamodel could be very useful when we want to replace computational burdensome simulation. And we identified the best DNN size for among our experiments. And the performance of that model was below 1%. So I want to thank you all for listening. If you have any questions, I will be happy to answer.
Questions? Very interesting presentation. Thank you very much. My name is Howard Jalal. I'm University of Pittsburgh. I have special interest in using metamodeling, and it's very good to see it being implemented. My quick question is that, what did you use for validation versus training? What's the split?
So we basically simulated 10,000 samples out of the simulation, and we used another 1,000 for training.
I see.
But there is no, we have the training set, and the validation set, but there's no test set. Yeah.
Oh, you didn't
if
have
you are
the
wondering
test.
about that.
Okay, so
Yeah.
you didn't do that. And the results that you were showing were against the validation set?
Yeah,
or-
these are all
validation
for
set.
the validation test.
So even though you are using a validation set, but just given that you only have, I think, 96 outputs, right? There's
Yes.
still a probability, a non-zero probability that there might be this by chance, right? Because like the fitting result, just by statistical probability.
Let me try to understand. So, like, what you are saying is we can get this result by chance, like even if we trained
Yeah,
it?
because you're running for 100,000 epochs, and you have a massively complicated model, so you have a lot of parameters in the model. So there's still like, I don't know, maybe that's not real, but there might be still a non-zero probability that that could happen just by chance. But
Yeah.
Is that right? Okay.
Yeah, that's definitely correct. Yeah, yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, Jeremy Goldhaber-Fever, Stanford. So I was intrigued about the thing that you said on the last slide, which is the motivation for this in general, which is to think about this as replacing the other model, right? And that's very appealing. Part of what I thought was a motivation for this would be to kind of do fast prediction. But if you're really talking about replacing kind of a more complicated simulation model, another application that you might want to do with it is talking about modeling interventions, right?
Yeah.
So can you talk a little bit, so when you have like a deep neural net, there's not an obvious place to kind of like, oh, we have a new intervention that we'd like to model. It's much harder to kind of conceptualize what exactly is that intervention changing, and then how is the model going to make prediction on it. So can you talk to us? So if I were to replace using my complex microsimulation model with the deep neural net, how do I think about now considering a set of interventions, and how do I kind of map those into such a kind of meta-model framework?
Okay. Let me try to answer your question by, so you go back to the input layer. So actually, I mean, this is one thing that we have tried. So I said 18 neurons, but there are 17 parameters here.
Yeah.
So the last parameter that I didn't put here is the intervention that we have tried. So we basically changed we only had one intervention. It was something, I would say, abstract. It was not like something that we can physically apply. What we were saying is, if we have different incidence values by some intervention that we don't know, but if someone intervened and changed this incidence rate, what would happen? And we tried that, and we modeled that as an additional model parameter here.
Yeah.
And it actually worked. I mean, I don't have the results here, but here right now.
Let me just clarify, and then I don't want to.
Yeah.
So you trained the model on that contained an intervention. So I'm saying if I now have another intervention that I want to consider, and it operates in a different way than it makes incidence go down or something like that.
I think.
Do I have to retrain the DNN with the now expanded microsimulation because I don't really have a sense of what I need to change inside of the neural net? So I have to go through the 100,000 epochs again and relearn the model after I've implemented the new intervention in my actual model and run the things to train on. Would that be accurate?
This can be a little bit technical, but there's a thing called training transfer. It is, basically transferring your learning to another model. I don't know if it's applicable in this case, but possibly it is, because we are just adding another variable to model, right? I don't think it would deviate so much from training a whole model from scratch. But that's definitely we should discuss. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, David Neymark from University of Toronto. Do you worry about, as the complexity of the net goes up, do you worry about overfitting, and if so, how do you guard against that?
Yeah, that's a really good question, actually. In this particular model, we didn't worry about overfitting because, there are ways to overcome overfitting. That's one thing, but the problem with the beautiful part of these models is we know that all of these variables are not correlated. So, I mean, somehow, for example, if you try to fit a real data, you will have some features that may not be actually affecting your model, and you will overfit to those features. But in this case, we know that all of these parameters are changing something in the model. So, I mean, the chance of overfitting is really low. Even if it overfits, there are ways to overcome in the deep neural network settings like regularization, or there's this dropout regularization, which basically removes some of the neurons on the training process. So
yeah, I think in the interest of the time, we have to move on, unfortunately, sorry. Okay. So Ozden Daljic will continue on the second presentation on an interactive simulation tool for long-term outcomes of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease.
Sorry, it's me again. Okay, so the title of this talk is NAFLD Simulator. Again, I want to start with thanking to my co-authors on this study. And here is the funding and the disclosure information. So I want to start a little bit of background of NAFLD. NAFLD stands for non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. It's a liver condition in which there is fat accumulation in liver. And but this fat accumulation is not caused by alcohol or viral infection. And we don't know the actual cause, but the disease is highly associated with obesity and type 2 diabetes. There is a severe form of NAFLD known as NASH, non-alcoholic steatohepatitis. In NASH, on top of the fat accumulation, there is inflammation and liver cell damage. And this can lead to fibrosis, and fibrosis can progress to cirrhosis and liver failure. And the only way to save, only curative option at this stage is liver transplantation. NASH is actually projected to become the leading indication of liver transplant by next year. So, more background on NAFLD. NAFLD has a really high prevalence, between 25 to 40% around the world. And there is no cure or treatment, approved cure or treatment yet. There are some treatments in the clinical trials which can potentially reduce this burden, but they are in the early stages. And there's another problem with NAFLD, it is really silent. It may take years to decades to progress to final stages. Therefore, clinical trials use surrogate markers like one-stage improvement instead of the actual markers. And even if we have an approved treatment, it would take years to get the long-term outcomes. Therefore, we want to develop this open access interactive tool for different stakeholders, which will explain the long-term outcomes associated with NAFLD and NASH. And we also aim to create an awareness about the adverse consequences of NAFLD and NASH. Therefore, we developed this natural history model using microsimulation. In this simulation, each year patients move from one stage to another. And we also modeled 3 types of mortalities. The background mortality, which affects everyone. Non-liver related mortality, which is a cardiovascular risk, which affects everyone except NAFLD patients. And the liver-related mortality, which only affects the advanced stages of the disease. And so this is a state transition model, and most of the transition probabilities were available in the literature, but some were not. So the red one shows that we don't have those values. And we had the background mortality from the life tables. We had the non-liver-related mortality for some stages, and we didn't have the liver-related mortality for F4 stage. So these unknown parameters were obtained via a calibration process so that the final outcomes are matching the survival rates of a large observational study. And as our goodness of fit measures, we use mean squared error. It's basically the squared deviation of our results from the observed data. And we use simulated annealing to minimize our error, which is a stochastic global optimization approach. So before we move on, I want to talk about this ensemble-based interval estimation. So if you are familiar with calibration, at the end of the calibration, you will have a single value. But instead of this approach, we redid the calibration process for 1,000 times by using different initial solutions. At the end, using all this, we created an uncertainty band using the 5th and the 95th percentile. So, and the line shows the median. And now out of this 1,000 distribution, we didn't end up with a single value. We end up a distribution for each of the parameters. So now let's move to validation. So as you can see here, these graphs show the survival rate of the large observational study, which is the black one, and the simulation that we calibrated, which is the yellow one. So in almost all cases, except this small part, it seems like it did a really good job. So now we have this running engine which can generate all kinds of different outcomes that we want, but we said why we should keep this to ourselves. So we should make it available to anyone, basically. Therefore, we created this website at nafldssimulator.org. So when you click on this, so this is the landing page. When you click on this NAFLD simulator button, it will take you to the simulator page, which has this input panel on the left and the output panel on the right. And in the input panel, we can change the age, sex, and the NAFLD stage that we are interested in. And based on this input selection, it will generate the outcomes on the output panel. It will give us the survival up to 15 years for all the stages. It will give us the 10-year mortality by different mortality types, liver-related mortality, non-liver-related mortality, and background mortality. And it will give us the risk of cirrhosis and risk of liver cancer, which is hepatocellular carcinoma. It also allows us to generate a report, a dynamic report out of our selection, and we can download all the figures that we have seen in the simulation, in the simulator. And one final thing is, because our secondary objective is to create an awareness of FLD disease, so we prepared some educational components. I guess I have time. Maybe I can run this video up to 1 minute, maybe.
Non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, or NAFLD, is a condition in which excess fat is stored in the liver, not caused by heavy alcohol use. A severe form of NAFLD is non-alcoholic steatohepatitis, or NASH, which is inflammation and liver cell damage, in addition to fat buildup. NASH is a silent and chronic disease. NASH patients have a doubling of cardiovascular risk, and more than 10-fold increased risk of liver-related death. NASH can cause fibrosis, which can progress to cirrhosis. Cirrhosis can then lead to liver failure and liver cancer. NAFLD has a global prevalence between 20 to 30.
So, yeah, I kind of got down there. So, in summary, we developed this natural history model for NAFLD and NASH, and we calibrated our model using a large observational study. And at the end, we developed an online tool out of it for the use of different stakeholders. So, and as a next step, we want to include the non-invasive detection of fibrosis stages. There is this uncertainty when you are using an ultrasound to detect the NAFLD stage. So we want to incorporate that. And we also want to include some more factors, such as having diabetes or the body mass index. And we want to add treatment when it is approved. So again, I would like to thank you all
Thank
for
you.
listening to it.
Thank you. Well, before I open it up for questions, there are seats in front. If you are standing, feel free to come in front and have a seat.
So I had a question on the slide that you titled validation, which I think is just showing us your calibration results and not actually a validation against independent data. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, so I wanted to know sort of two related things. First is, are you concerned that you might not be, that you might be underestimating the uncertainty in your parameters, given that it looks like your simulation uncertainty bands are systematically substantially narrower than the data uncertainty bands? And secondly, are you worried that there may be some bias, especially in the likelihood of long-term survival for people with F1 fibrosis? And that might be a particular concern because they have to pass through F1 before they go to the later fibrosis stage, so sort of like an excess risk early on in terms of lower estimating the burden and estimating it with higher certainty than your data might imply.
Okay. Let me start with the first one. So, yeah, you are definitely right. The band is narrower than the calibration band. But if you think about it, it is better than having a single line. So we are trying to give an uncertainty band by this ensemble-based interval estimation. But you are right. I mean, if we could expand it, we would. But this is what we got out of the simulated annealing. So, but definitely we can try to expand this to get a better match with the data. So your second question is this F1, as far as I remember. Yes, you are right. It seems like our simulation survival is worse than the actual results, but it is after year 20, and we are not even projecting in the simulator itself. We are not even projecting beyond 15 years, and it is kind of an conservative approach. I mean, this is not like you are going to say that you are not gonna die, but you will. This is a conservative approach. What you are saying is, I am predicting these results worse than it should be.
It's only conservative if I'm estimating the value of an intervention, it's not conservative, because you'll overestimate the survival gain if I prevent it.
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah. Yeah, I definitely agree that, yeah.
Right.
Thank you for pointing that out.
Next question.
Just a technical question about the simulated annealing process. So how do you pick some of the features of that process, like the artificial temperature decline and the Boltzmann constant? And did you have a systematic way of picking those?
Not really. I mean, we used algorithms designed in a package in R, generalized simulated annealing, off the shelf. We didn't tune any of the. What I did is I just changed one of the parameters, hyperparameters of the algorithm, which is called smoothness, which basically considers whether your surface of optimization is smooth or not. And I set it to false. That's the only thing that I tried.
Helen.
So I was wondering if you could show the parameter values that you had. I think it's the slide after your validation.
Right after
yeah,
this.
So this one. Yeah. So when I look at that, it seems to me like you don't have a lot of information about a lot of these parameters, like the F0 to F1. So,
yes.
So could you say a little bit more about that? I mean, that to me raises some concerns that maybe it's a little bit gets to this issue with the survival.
Oh, I see. So, I mean, we initially started with 0 to 1. So we set the whole range free for the calibration. Then we talked to some experts, and we said 20%, up to 20% is acceptable. And we didn't play with it. Actually, I mean, maybe it would be better if we play with the lower bound of this so that we would have some, I don't know if that's the question.
So if the lower bound, like if it's not plausible that it's near 0, why are you getting parameter estimates out of your calibration that are very close to 0? To me, that looks like it's a very rough, very highly variable uniform distribution is what that looks like. So it looks like there's no information in your data about that transition. So I guess that's what I'm wondering. What do you get that back from your calibration approach? How much information do I have? Where might I need to get additional data to inform my model?
I see. So, so for example, if you have a patient, so if you consider this zero probability, the very lower end, so it seems like you have some patients in your population which are not progressing at all, and that's possible. So, and that calibration point refers to those patients. You can consider this as that. But I know it is, I don't know if you want to get additional information out of this distribution, but.
So this represents individuals, not model parameters that would be used to simulate the entire population? I mean.
Yeah, I mean, it represents, the model parameters represents the actual individuals, right? So is that?
So let me urge to carry this conversation
Yep,
after
okay.
this session, and as we can move. But this is a good, very engaged discussion.
Yeah.
Sorry to cut it off. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, so the next presentation will be given by Giovanni Malloy from Stanford University, who will be presenting on the role of model structure in predicting the effectiveness of interventions for infectious disease control.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. My name is Giovanni Malloy. I'm a third-year PhD student in the Department of Management Science and Engineering at Stanford University. And today I'll be presenting on predicting the effectiveness of infectious disease control interventions, the role of model structure. This is something I've been working on with Jeremy Goldhaber-Fiebert, Eva Enns, and Margaret Brando. So to begin, I'd like to put everybody in the shoes of an infectious disease modeler and thinking about what is the next model that you're going to make. You have this disease, and you have to think about a balance between simplicity and realism in your model. How complex do you want to make this model? So many trade-offs exist between simplicity and realism. So our motivating question is, how does the choice of model influence the short and long-term estimates of intervention effectiveness? So how do we reach our answer today? Well, we start with a computational study where we look at 4 different dynamic transmission models that vary along 2 different dimensions. The first dimension is homogeneous versus heterogeneous risk behaviors. The second dimension is contact network versus mass action mixing models of transmission. We calibrate all of these models to the same equilibrium prevalence before we introduce any sort of intervention, and then we introduce a simple intervention that reduces transmission probabilities. Then we do a structural sensitivity analysis where we assess how the intervention effects differ across different models in both long and short-term intervention effects. So like I said, we define model complexity along 2 different dimensions. We have the mass action mixing model and the network model. And then we also have homogeneous risk and heterogeneous risk. You'll see that we have low risk and high risk individuals. Those mostly differ by transmission rate. So for example, transmission rate between 2 low-risk individuals is going to be higher than the transmission rate between 2 low-risk individuals. So we run a series of simulations. Each of these simulations starts with a model pre-intervention prevalence where we calibrate to 10% prevalence. Like I said before, we introduce a simple intervention that reduces disease transmission, and then we explore a variety of intervention efficacies and coverages that range from 5 to 100%. So how do we measure long-term and short-term effectiveness? Well, we do this in a number of ways. The first is we look at the long-term equilibrium prevalence. So after the model, after you've introduced the intervention, the model reaches a new stable equilibrium. What is that long-term prevalence? In the short term, we consider the rate of decline in prevalence. So in the first 100 days after you introduce an intervention, how fast are you approaching that new long-term equilibrium prevalence? And finally, we consider the effective reproduction ratio at the new equilibrium prevalence. So now I'll walk you through some of the results based on these 4 models. So first, I'd like to look at the long-term prevalence. So you can see that we have 4 different contour plots up here. Along the x-axis, we have intervention coverage. Y-axis, we have intervention efficacy. And you can see the dark blue is a lower prevalence going up to a higher prevalence in yellow. The first thing to point out is that we have all 4 of our models here. So we have mass action mixing model with homogeneous risk, network model with homogeneous risk, mass action mixing model with heterogeneous risk, and network model with heterogeneous risk. And we see that generally the network models have a higher long-term prevalence for the same combination of efficacy and coverage than the mass action mixing models. And if this is tough to see on the contour plots in the back, I've come prepared with an example. So, for example, we take a 1% long-term prevalence, which I've highlighted here on the left in this red U-shaped curve. So for the mass action mixing models, we require an intervention and coverage, efficacy and coverage that is moderate to low, versus the network model where you need a much higher combination of intervention, efficacy, and coverage to achieve that same long-term equilibrium prevalence. The other thing to note is that risk stratification seems to be more important in network models than in the mass action mixing models. Next, I'll walk you through the results related to the rate of decline in prevalence. So we have our similarly laid out models across these different contour plots. And this time, we'll be talking about the rate of decline in prevalence in terms of people per day. So in the dark blue, it's 0 people per day, no decline, all the way to the dark red, which is about 7 people per day. The big takeaway here is that the mass action mixing models have a higher rate of decline in prevalence than the network models. And generally, risk stratification has a lesser impact. Now I'll talk about the effective reproduction ratio. So in this case, we have our models laid out. With the lighter color red, we have a lower effective reproduction ratio. Darker red is a higher reproductive ratio. And then I'll just anchor us on the basic reproduction ratio of each model, which is essentially the strength of the epidemic spread. So here we have 1.11 for the mass action mixing model with homogeneous risk. The network model has 1.27. The mass action mixing model with heterogeneous risk has a basic reproduction ratio of 1.13, where the network model has a basic reproduction ratio of 1.47. So first thing to note is that the network model starts with a higher basic reproduction ratio, and then the effective reproduction ratio of the mass action mixing models for every combination of intervention coverage and efficacy finds a home less than 1, which is not true of the network models. And this is important because, as we all probably know, the effective reproduction ratio being less than 1 means that the epidemic is coming to an end, or the outbreak. So next, I looked at the effective reproduction ratio and the long-term prevalence, more specifically long-term prevalence as a function of effective reproduction ratio. So you can see along the x-axis, we have the effective reproduction ratio. Along the y-axis, we have the long-term prevalence. And then the colors are a little bit difficult to make out on this screen, but we have the green and orange. We have the green and orange dots kind of towards the left, which are the mass action mixing models, and the purple and pink dots are the network models towards the right. So the first thing to note is that as you're looking at this area around the effective reproduction ratio close to 1, the network model long-term equilibrium prevalence tends to be a little lower than the mass action mixing model, and we can also see very clearly that it is difficult to get the network model to a place where the effective reproduction ratio is below 1. So we do a similar sort of exercise with the rate of prevalence decline. We model that now as the y-axis, and we have our function of rate of prevalence decline and effective reproduction ratio. Again, you can see the mass action mixing model are the dots sort of clumped a little bit to the left, and the network model are the dots clumped a little bit to the right. So we can see that as we're around that critical point where the effective reproduction ratio is around 1, the network model has a little bit higher decline in the rate of prevalence than the mass action mixing models. And again, you can see that in order to achieve an effective reproduction ratio below 1, it's rather difficult in the network model. So I'll just wrap up with a few conclusions. So first, our work highlights the importance of structural sensitivity analysis when estimating intervention effects. And I'll make mention that these conclusions, the upcoming conclusions, are based on these 4 model archetypes that I described here today and might not necessarily be generally applicable. But when calibrated to the same pre-intervention prevalence, we see that mass action mixing models tend to have a lower long-term prevalence than network models, and they also have a higher rate of short-term decline in prevalence than the network models. However, when we're controlling for effective reproduction ratio, as I showed, the network models for the same effective reproduction ratio have a lower long-term prevalence and higher rate of short-term prevalence decline than the mass action mixing model. And then as a final kind of takeaway, that the model structure for these 4 models tended to have a larger effect in both the long term and the short term than the risk stratification differences. And with that, I will take any questions.
So I was struck by how much more variable the network model results looked, and I was wondering, did you use the same simulated population size for both? And is it possible, did you explore whether perhaps the network model needs to be simulated with a larger population size?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the population sizes for all the models were 10,000 individuals. Yeah, I think a lot of what you see, especially in the rate of prevalence decline contour plots, have some kind of funky lines that I think a lot of that can be attributed to some Monte Carlo noise. So additional simulations would definitely be helpful, but expanding that population size is definitely a good idea going forward. Thanks.
So several issues. First, I'm not an expert in network modeling, but looking into the proper definition of modeling, I take one that says that a model is as large. A model is a simplification of reality. So if the model is too complex, too large, if a map is too large and too detailed, it will become the reality. For example, that's
yeah.
So when you use network modeling, we are using a simple strategy, but we are using usually a complex set of parameters for contact rates and so forth. So we use a so-called simpler model. We in the simple model, we can, in fact, in this type of example, we can model the contact rates, for example. So on the definition of modeling, we can say that the model is, as close to reality, but we can also say that it changes rapidly. So the reality changes rapidly. So the model will not be as successful in the long term predicting the change of reality. And part of what I'm not an expert in network modeling is because of the complexity in the results and the lack of simplification that it has when we interpret the results and show them to a decision maker. So all of this to say what what this struck me as important because what is the main use utilization that you see of table modeling in infectious diseases, apart of course, contact rates of sexual infectious diseases, for example. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, so I think that network models can be really important in populations where you have a good understanding of how individuals interact in a way that could produce transmission. So for example, as you mentioned, in communities of people who inject drugs, you have a better idea of contacts that could lead to transmission of the disease, whereas in flu, for example, it's a little bit more ambiguous, and therefore maybe a mass action mixing model is a little more appropriate. I don't know if that answers the question fully, but.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. I just had a clarification question on the contour plots with
Sure.
Coverage and efficacy.
Yeah.
They seem to be perfectly symmetrical, and so I was wondering if it's because of an artifact of modeling, and basically the modeling of coverage and efficacy is symmetrical, and that you have basically maybe A multiplied by B, in a sort of, or if you could just clarify the way it's modeled.
Sure, yeah. So the efficacy itself is actually maybe one of these earlier slides will be more instructive. There we go. So the efficacy itself is simply a reduction in the rate, the transmission rates in the model. So for example, in the mass action mixing model with heterogeneous risk, there's 3 transmission rates. Efficacy of 50% means 50% reduction in transmission rate. And then the coverage, as you can see, kind of there's a lighter color box and a darker color box. I didn't have time to address this in the talk, but this is essentially the difference between the covered individuals and the not covered individuals. So we model those as separate compartments, but essentially when you are covered with that, with an intervention, so if 50% of the individuals are covered, then 50% are in the dark colored box, and those 50% would have that reduced transmission rate, while those non-covered individuals would not have the reduced transmission rate. Yeah, I think that the implementation of the intervention was intentionally pretty simple. So I think you have basically you are compounding 25% efficacy and 25% coverage. I think those kind of compound and work together. So that could be one of the explanations, but they're not completely symmetric. It's a little tough to see on the slides, but.
All right. Let's thank the speaker. Thank you. Our next speaker and the last speaker of this session is Q Lee from Stanford University, and she's going to talk about calibration to cross-sectional data when both cohort trends exist in a specific application.
Hello, everyone. My name is Q. I'm a PhD student at Stanford University. Today, I'm going to talk about the model calibration to cross-sectional data when the temporal trend exists. Before I get started, I would like to thank my mentors, Jeremy and Josh, who provided great support for this project. And this is my current funding, and I have no conflict of interest to declare. So calibration is a technique to infer parameter values by matching the model's outcome to the observed data or the calibration target. And we choose the calibration target based on whether the data are available and whether the model can generate the relevant outcomes. In general, models whose parameters are more finely stratified requires to have more granular calibration target to be identifiable. For example, when we model the transition from healthy to sick, the probability can be uniform as P, can be stratified by age, can be further stratified by age and year. Accordingly, the level of granularity in the calibration target should increase from the prevalence of sick to the age and birth cohort specific prevalence of sick in order to allow the calibration process to identify these stratified parameters. Such granular data are often expensive and hence not available. The modeling studies often use the cross-sectional data as their calibration target when they're estimating age-specific parameters. And by taking all the age groups in one cross-sectional year as one cohort, they assume that there's no temporal trend exists in risk behaviors or disease natural history. However, the cross-sectional data are actually the stack of multiple birth cohorts whose trajectory of the disease may be different. In this case, the assumption of no temporal trend is no longer valid and may produce bias. And this brings us the question of whether the parameters calibrated to the cross-sectional data are still valid for predicting future burden of disease or policy effect estimation. I found that the drinking behavior in China would be a good place to look into this question because first, there was a change in tax policy in 2001 and 2006, which resulted in the consequent change in the alcohol production and per capita alcohol consumptions. And also in general, there was an increase in the total alcohol consumption in the population, mainly due to the economic growth. More related to the health outcome, there was a change in heavy drinking prevalence that was observed in the multiple years of data. Therefore, in this study, I aim to quantify the bias in the calibrated parameters and other model outcomes when the model calibration does not consider the birth cohort effect, and we use the example of high-risk drinking behavior in China in order to address this question. Moving on to the method, this is the overview of my analysis where I compare the cross-sectional and birth cohort calibration. I'm going to get into the details of each category in the next few slides. However, I would like to point out that the main difference between the two approaches came from different stratification in the calibration parameter and different level of granularity in the calibration target. For both approaches, I use 4-step Markov cohort model where I simulate the change in heavy drinking behavior among the Chinese men on the annual basis. Everyone starts as never heavy drinker and they can start, quit, or resume heavy drinking over time. The parameters of our interest include the probabilities of starting or quitting heavy drinking. And in cross-sectional calibration, we are estimating age-specific parameters, whereas the birth cohort model does, but for age and birth cohort-specific parameters. For cross-sectional calibration, we took the age-specific prevalence of heavy drinking in one cross-sectional year as the calibration target. Because multiple years of data were available, we varied the year of the target data in case that affects the results in the cross-sectional calibration. And the second calibration target is the age-specific prevalence of never or formal heavy drinkers in 2011. For birth cohort calibration, we constructed age and birth cohort specific prevalence of heavy drinking by following up the birth cohort, which is defined based on their age in 1993, on this longitudinal data from 1993 through 2011. For the second calibration target, rather than taking the all age groups in 2001 as one cohort, we decomposed them based on their age in 1993 in order to generate the birth cohort specific estimates on this. In order to estimate the parameter values, we use Bayesian calibration. Specifically, we use sampling importance resampling, where we sample the parameters from the prior distribution, calculate the likelihood based on the target data, and use them as a sampling weight in the resampling stage in order to generate the approximate of the posterior distribution. Between two approaches, I compared 4 outcomes. First, I confirmed their calibration fit. Second, we compared the bias in predicting heavy drinking prevalence in 2015. Because the birth cohort calibration allows us to infer the time trends in the calibrated parameters, we use both calibrated and extrapolated probabilities in order to predict the future heavy drinking, whereas the cross-sectional calibration assumes no temporal trend in each parameter, so we fix the parameter at the level where they were calibrated to. By using the same method, we further projected the overall heavy drinking prevalence through 2027. Lastly, we compared the policy effect estimation by considering a hypothetical mitigation policy to prevent initiating or resuming heavy drinking in a target age group. So here's what we have found. First, we confirmed that both approaches can achieve good calibration to fit to their calibration target. The cross-sectional model was generating the consistent age-specific prevalence of heavy drinking, and so did birth cohort model, but for the age and birth cohort-specific prevalence of heavy drinking. Even though both approaches can achieve good calibration fit, the age patterns in the calibrated parameters were different. For example, in cross-sectional model, the probability of initiating heavy drinking increased by age up to age 47 and decreased sharply afterwards, whereas the birth cohort model generated more smoother age pattern in its probability of starting heavy drinking. The difference was more obvious when we compared the probability of quitting heavy drinking. The probability remained constant up to age 47, again in the cross-sectional model, and start to decrease sharply afterwards, whereas birth cohort model again had more smoother age pattern by have this fall and rise pattern. When we compare their bias in predicting heavy drinking prevalence in 2015, as a measure of sum of square errors, we found that the birth cohort model performed better than all the other cross-sectional models. And interestingly, when we compare across the cross-sectional models in their performance did not improve as the year of the target data get closer to the year of 2015. For example, when we calibrate the model to the year of 2000, it was not better than when we calibrate the model to the data in 1993. When we further project the overall heavy drinking prevalence through 2027, the parameters calibrated to the birth cohort data predicted declining trend in prevalence through 2027, which was reasonably continuous from what we have observed in the past, whereas the parameters calibrated to the cross-sectional data, because it assumes that there's no temporal trend in the parameter, it predicted the constant future heavy drinking prevalence throughout the 2027. Lastly, when we compare the estimated policy effect, particularly by considering the intervention to prevent starting or resuming heavy drinking in a target age group, when you compare the purple bar versus non-purple bars, you can see that all the models that use the cross-sectional approach estimated much substantially larger intervention effect compared to the birth cohort model. And interestingly, even the cross-sectional calibration to the year of 2011 data, which had pretty similar projective validity, still estimated substantially larger intervention effect compared to the birth cohort model. So from this study, we found that we need to put more effort to understand the temporal trend in the longitudinal data before we use them as a calibration target. If the longitudinal data or the repeated cross-sectional data are available, conducting birth cohort or pure defect analysis would be helpful to identify such trend. If such data are not available, identifying the past policy change that led the change in the disease epidemiology or health risk behavior would be helpful to understand these temporal trends. And also, it is important to evaluate the impact of no secular trend assumption in our model calibration and future projection by conducting the sensitivity analysis with the varying secular trends in the parameters. So in conclusion, calibration to cross-sectional data identify very different calibrated parameters compared to the birth cohort model. And such difference between the two approaches can be even more when we use a calibrated model to make the future projections on the burden of disease or the policy effect estimation. And when the longitudinal data are not available, it is important to identify some exogenous factors that can change the disease epidemiology or the risk behaviors over time. Thank you for your attention. And I know that I have mentioned this a lot, but I am on the job market. Please hire me.
All right, this paper is open for questions.
Presentation. I have a quick question about the setup. So, to my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong. So, what you are doing is, for the period effect, you are simulating a single cohort going through time, and for the cohort effect, so for the birth cohort effect, you are simulating multiple cohorts.
Yes, that's multiple cohort model. So I basically repeat the simulation process for each birth cohort, and I read the trend from from older birth cohort to younger birth cohort in order to see the time trends in the parameters.
So is it the case that you have more parameters for the birth cohort models then than for the period cohort?
Yes.
So could that also explain why the fit is also a little bit better for the age categories? Is that something like you were getting better fit? This one, yes.
Yeah, so that's why. So there in general, there was a decreasing trend in the prevalence, like cross-sectional prevalence.
Okay.
And then the birth cohort model predicted the declining trend in the parameters, which gives me the lower prevalence, the predicted prevalence in 2015.
I see.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Yep.
Let me follow up on a chair's question. Please go ahead. So in most data, you wouldn't find all the birth cohorts and all the ages, right? Some of the cells would be missing. So did you find if grouping both cohorts versus grouping age is more, provides a better fit to the data? So either you can, have bigger age groups and very finer birth cohorts, or you can have, bigger birth cohorts and very fine age groups. And do you see a difference between if any of those provide a better fit?
I haven't really tested whether the age effect or the birth cohort effect derives a change in the prevalence of heavy drinking yet. But I think I agree with your point that I think it really depends on what have derived the change in the disease epidemiology, the health risk behaviors. And if I group on the fact that have less influence on the change in disease epidemiology, I think that will give me a better calibration outcomes.
Yep.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
In biostatistics, there's the age period cohort model, and it's known that there's a non-identifiability problem. Sometimes you can fix one and then change the other, and you get equally good fit. My experience of applying APC model in simulation is depending on where you put the period or different effects in different transition rate, sometimes it's going to change your model fit as well too. And in your experience, have you tried putting different transition rate at different effects in different transition rate and examine the impacts of that? How is it going to affect your model outcome?
So if I understand it correctly, so first of all, I didn't differentiate between the birth cohort effect and the period effect in my analysis by fixing the age. I don't know whether I have the right. So yes, so when we say a time trends, it can be a mix of period effect and then the birth cohort effect in my simulation. I don't know whether that was what you were asking. And I think it is not possible to tease that out in my analysis.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, sorry.
Any other questions? All right, then let's thank the speaker.
Thank you.
And we are done for this session. I don't know what's next. We are done? Thank you. Thanks, that was great.
It's good practice for me.
Yeah. It's sometimes people just keep asking questions.